Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Sophia Rosenfeld, who is a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the author of a couple of really nice books. The most recent one is called The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life, which was preceded by this one called Common Sense, A Political History. And then somewhere in there, you wrote Democracy and Truth, which I unfortunately was unable to get my hands on in time for this interview. Welcome, Sophia.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So your style of history is, I really enjoy it. And I don't know whether there's a term for it, but maybe for lack of a better term, it's kind of like doxic history. Can I say that? Is that a term?
You can say that, and I think you might have just invented it, but that's okay. And a less fancy way to say that might be, I think of myself as a historian of the taken for granted, or a historian of the things we all probably think but don't think about very much. I like ideas that a lot of intellectual historians like to study, the ideas that are most fought over. I like to study the ones that are sort of so obvious and so commonplace that there's not that much discussion of them.
Yeah, I mean, I spent some time studying intellectual history back actually at University of Pennsylvania, right, where you are. And yeah, I mean, we spent most of the time focusing on the great authors, right? Nonfiction authors primarily, philosophers and so forth. But I mean, you spend time talking about them also, but also you talk about, fiction writers, novelists, but then you look at documents like dance cards and other sorts of things. I mean, when something is taken for granted, people don't tend to talk about it that much. So how do you kind of get at it without visiting them like an anthropologist, right? So anthropologists, I mean, you cite Clifford Geertz at the beginning of the book. I mean, they actually go and spend time with these folks. How can we spend time with folks from 200, 300 years ago?
It's a great question, and it's what makes history so fun in a way to do, is that you always have incomplete information. You cannot interview, unless you write very recent history, you can't interview the people who were involved, and the records they left behind are always partial. They don't tell you exactly what you want to know. People don't usually write down, I did this because I was thinking the following. That's not how we operate. So you are left, in a sense, with a set of clues. And I like to think of the historian a little bit like a detective who goes out looking for the clues. In my case, I'm looking for the clues about ways of thinking that were not always explicit, but are sort of the implied assumptions of different periods. And one way to find them for sure is to look at the works of important philosophers of a moment. But it strikes me as unlikely, for instance, that everybody sort of went out and read Kant and then changed their mind about freedom. That isn't how ideas work today. It isn't how they worked in the past. So I think alongside reading the works of famous philosophers and famous intellectuals, one has to look for clues all over the place. And since I was writing a book about choice, I tried to look at everything that might have revealed how people thought about choice, ranging, as you say, from novels, where often the central figure is involved in thinking through some very difficult choice, has internal desires, but also pressures that are from outside. But I also looked at the kinds of things people make choices from: menus, dance cards, ballots, surveys, the sort of ephemera of choice, some of which I simply found on eBay, but some of which is stored in repositories of different kinds. I think I'm the kind of intellectual historian who casts a very, very wide net, looking for these clues anywhere I can find them.
Well, in some ways, the book Age of Choice, you could view it as sort of a genealogy of the modern worldview of the economist, right? And so at the end of the chapter, then you start entering into my world. And I start seeing all the, Walras and Menger and all of those folks. And to some extent, I think your approach, what you're saying is that even if these folks didn't exist, there would have been this same trend happening, right? They're not just shaping things, but they're sort of articulating things that are happening in the background, right?
That's a nice way of putting it, that they're articulating things that are happening. But I do think the way they get articulated then has effects on the way things are done too. So it's almost like a three-way street as I see it. There's the things we do, there's the things we think, and there's the ways we talk about them. And none of them always determines the other two, but they're in some kind of dance. So modern economics, one could write a kind of internal history and say, what have economists said over time? But one could also think about the ways in which how we live has shaped economic theory, but also how economic theory to this day shapes how we talk about everything from inflation to jobs numbers. And the way we go about our business too is shaped all the time by people ranging from formal economists to marketing experts.
Now, one of the most difficult things about writing a history that I found when I was trying to write history was, where do you start, right? Because these things have origins that have origins of their own. And you decided in the book, Age of Choice, to begin with the shopper, right, in 18th century. So why did you start there? I mean, I have a hunch, because when I think about how we begin our economics classes on day one, we start with the shopper. Right? Even on my slide deck on day one, I have a picture of someone with a shopping cart who's, putting things in the basket. And so this idea of the shopper, I mean, it didn't really exist. There wasn't really a term for it, right, before the 18th century.
So it's interesting you brought up the example of the basket or the cart. And of course, this is a very ancient model, but it's still something we're really familiar with insofar as you can't go to Amazon and not put something in a basket, right? This is still, even online, the way we go about this business.
Your little icon of
little icon of the little basket. It looks just like a basket always looked. So in some ways, there are these kind of continuities through all of this. But why start with shopping? Because after all, people have always bought things that they needed. People went to markets in the ancient world. It's not like anybody never bought anything before the 17th or 18th century. But something happens that I think is really pivotal, starting the late 17th century, but really accelerating by the late 18th century, which is when the neologism shopping is invented in English, and it often gets used as shopping in other languages in Europe in this period. And that's this actual specific activity of going into a fixed location shop, a store, looking at displayed examples of things one could purchase, judging them, browsing, maybe doing this with friends, comparing the options, and ultimately making a decision less based on simply what is available or what is suitable for my station, say, but on what do I like? Do I like the yellow fabric or the blue fabric? Do I like checks or do I like stripes? And the combination of the development of the store, the emergence of patterned fabrics, many of them from India, calicos in particular, that were available for mass consumption, and this new behavior of turning the act of buying something into a kind of activity, a social activity even, produced an emphasis on choice that was really new. And it became a marketing term, and it became an activity. And that's one of my starting points for the book. I sort of have two starting points. There's one that's commercial, as you just pointed out, and the other has more to do with religious culture and changes in ideas in about the same period. But you're right, it's very hard to find a starting place. And for me, this seemed to be a kind of pivotal moment, even though the birth of shopping isn't usually what we mean by, say, revolution of the 18th century.
Right. And what this means is that people have to then figure out sort of what their preference is, right? They have to sort of, make decisions that they may not have had to make in the past, right? I mean, or if they did make decisions in the past, they did so according to some normative criteria, right? So Hercules' choice, that's what people meant by choice back in the day, was, do you choose to be, right or wrong? Do you choose to be virtuous or vicious? But this is a very different type of choice.
So that's the critical part of the story, and I'm glad you pointed to that, because it's not just that more opportunities for choice arose or that more options were on the table, though those were both true too. It's also that choice started to take on this new dimension. Instead of, as you say, Hercules' choice, which is to do the virtuous thing or the unvirtuous thing, or a choice that's essentially made for you, which is to say, with this amount of money, this is the one option that conforms to what you're able to buy or what you should buy. The emergence of the idea of both variety and preference are really important. And it would seem obvious, except for the fact that people don't talk about preference in the same way until relatively recent in the long sweep of history. The idea that you have some internal ideas that are distinctive to you, the same way you might prefer one food to another or one person to another, and that what you should be able to do when you choose is actualize that preference, and often in a sort of value neutral way that says, it's your decision whether you like chicken or beef or the blue fabric or the yellow fabric. And that's a very interesting form of choice. And it's one we're super used to. We all do it all day long. But it has novelty at a certain point, and it starts to take on this important quality of seeming like a kind of personal freedom.
Well, I think you mentioned that this idea of value-free choice. I mean, back then, it wasn't quite so simple. I mean, most of the time when we have choices, there are still these norms that come in, right? You talked about how politeness and taste, right, would constrain these choices. So you still had to worry about making the right choices, right?
Absolutely. So that's the other pressure, right? And with choice is scary. I mean, you really don't want to find out there are 4,000 options on anything that you want to do. You want there to be, in a sense, a set of options that's contained. It's the only, and you usually want some guidance as to how to do this well. Sometimes that guidance comes from other people's ideas, but we're steered in all sorts of ways. We use all sorts of advisors, financial advisors, decorators, algorithms, all the things that steer us all the time. Reading a fashion magazine from the 18th century onwards was a way to help you discover what clothes did you really want to be wearing. And so this intersection of sort of personal preference and guidelines, if I were a behavioral economist, I would call them choice architects, people who help us both design the menus and then help us navigate them, are in a sense an essential part of the story. So it's not just that the choosers arise, but all sorts of new ways of regulating choice arrive. Some of them are legal, formally legal, and some of them are informal, like all the kinds of advisors that, electronic and not, that we're used to.
So as the scope for choice increases, the demand for sort of, choice normativity increases because people are kind of confused, right? And overwhelmed to some degree.
Right. So when you go to Amazon, say, and you put in, whatever category, whether it's tea kettles or sneakers, it's dismaying to get 6,000 results. So you need some way of prioritizing among them. And that's true even if you don't want a slate of 100 political candidates either. We need some limits all the time, and we need advice. And we're always sort of navigating in ways between this idea that we have some internal preferences for reasons that are entirely personal, and we're looking for people to steer us, whether we want to be tasteful or correct, or whether we want to be socially conscious, or whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. So we want to have a lot of status, whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. We think we need help with those choices well beyond our preferences. And advertisers, of course, are well aware of this combination of things and try to play to both, that you'll be sort of fitting in by making the choice you're doing, but you'll simultaneously be able to express yourself in some way that's individualized too.
Well, it seems like as the scope for choice has increased in all these different domains, there have always been people who have critiqued the availability of choice and also the choosers. And part of this, I think you argue, is gendered, right? So very quickly, the prototypical shopper became a woman, right? And this is strange, right? Because I would imagine that men, and I think you said men were doing just as much choosing, if not more, right? Except they for somehow weren't perceived as being prototypical shoppers. So why is that?
So isn't it? It's very interesting, right? The discovery that shopping has always crossed sexes, though men and women have always shopped for different things. But that said, if Hercules is the prototype of the earlier version of the shopper, the man who's making a moral decision about what's the right thing to do, the newer kind of choice maker, the person who's deciding between two equally good pieces of ribbon, but likes one versus the other, is figured very early on as a woman. And it's interesting. The one reason I concentrate quite a bit on women in the book is, on the one hand, they emerge as the most modern of types. And on the other hand, they're always a little penalized for what seems like lightweight decisions about lightweight things, and made with a certain amount of inconstancy or fickleness. If I were in the 18th century, I'd say women are make their choices based on fancy and whim and things like that. Today, we'd say maybe they just don't know their mind, or they're greedy, or something else. But it both gives this kind of modern choice a feminine dimension and taints it a little bit as for the same reason.
Right. And so I think you highlight that women were considered whimsical, right? And like you say, fickle. And, perhaps when it comes to shopping for clothing or fabrics, that's no big deal. But I think that carried over to debates about emancipation. And even I was surprised to see when you were describing the Great Awakening, you said that the notion that you could kind of choose your preacher. This was seen as feminized, right? That the women would go around and find the preacher that was most persuasive, and there was something fickle about that, right?
You see it continually. I mean, it's once you start noticing this, you notice it, say, in the early debates about religious conversion, but it reappears around women's suffrage. Women don't have enough constancy of mind to make really important decisions like a political figure. And you might even see you say it as late as the 1970s and onwards, when the debate about the right to choose becomes central to abortion rights. Women's groups in the 1970s put forward the idea that the least controversial way to sort of normalize the option of abortion following the legalization of abortion after Roe v. Wade is to say, you don't have to have one, you don't have to like it, it's just going to be a matter of choice. And it was thought this would sort of avoid the kinds of controversies that other kinds of categorizations might have led to, like sexual emancipation or population control. And yet it's immediately countered, especially on the right, by the idea that this is a lightweight kind of right. It's the right to a lifestyle choice, it sounds like, as opposed to, say, the right to life, which is the pushback, this is the serious thing here. This is the moral and serious alternative. So choice is both deeply empowering for women. Feminism develops largely around the idea that women should have the same choices or same range of possibilities as men. But it's also always a way to, in a sense, push back on women, to say all they want is some kind of choice.
Well, when it comes to choosing religions, I mean, most of the people who are advocates of religious choice, I mean, they thought that people would make the right choice, right? It wasn't like they didn't think that wouldn't it be wonderful to have this world where, you have all these different beliefs coexisting, right? I don't think that any of the advocates of religious freedom in the early modern period would have, been fans of maybe Voltaire, but most of them wouldn't have been fans of the bumper sticker, right? To coexist. The idea was that if they were given freedom, they would ultimately kind of converge on the true religion, right? So why is it that they then wanted this freedom to choose your religion?
So it's a great question, because of course I'm not saying that people today or in the past picked religions the same way they pick refrigerators. These are, or spouses for that matter, that these have different kinds of parameters around them, different valences. Nevertheless, two interesting things happen in the aftermath of the Reformation. So again, going back into kind of early modern European history, but I think we still see the fallout now. One was the fact that after decades, centuries of warfare over religion, it became obvious that one form of Christianity was not going to survive by itself. Instead, there were going to be multiple strands, which already created, in the same way cloth does, a kind of possibility of pluralism. And especially somewhere like I live in Philadelphia, that was, always tourists as early as the 18th century were remarking on the extraordinary range of different kinds of Christians who coexisted in the city, different kinds of churches with different practices, different dogmas, different ideas about all sorts of things. And this was a kind of fallout in some ways of the Reformation. The other thing, though, is that Protestantism itself stresses from early on the idea of the importance of conscience, which was sometimes translated as the right to choose. In other words, the idea that one should consciously make a decision to embrace, as you say, the right faith. It didn't mean explore them all and pick the one you like. It meant certainly, at least initially, to pick the correct way, but still that this should be a conscious decision, not something that was simply a fact of your birth. And over time, that idea gets both secularized and as multiple sorts of ways of thinking about the world grow, secular and not. And then pretty soon you can hear various preachers, but you can also hear lectures of various kinds. You can go to lending libraries. You can read a wide range of books. Even in the 18th century in Philadelphia, this was all possible already. What starts to emerge is a kind of choice in ideas that I think has consequences down to this day. The idea that there are many ideas out there, there are many texts out there, and ultimately one chooses, not again in the same way as going to the supermarket, but nevertheless that one chooses a set of beliefs and ways of talking about them that appeal. And this is behind, say, even the First Amendment by the time it becomes actual.
And to what extent was the faith that people would make the right choice if given the opportunity connected to the emergence of this view of common sense that you describe in the other book?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And common sense has an interesting history too. It's common sense is, you'd think, well, of course, people have always thought there was common sense and there's an ancient equivalent, but it really isn't till the early 18th century, this is now the first half of the 18th century, that it starts to emerge as a political term. And it gets used, interestingly, just the opposite of what you might think. It gets used as soon as politics get polemical and parties start to emerge and factions start to say, we strongly disagree. Both sides find rhetorical fire in the idea it's only common sense what I'm speaking. And this is before we get to Tom Paine or anybody else. And so at a certain point, I decided, this was, 15 years ago, I wrote a book about common sense because I thought I'm a historian in some ways of common sense, but common sense itself needs a history. And what's been interesting to me is the way that common sense itself is always a political creation in different eras and gets used to do a wide variety of political things. And you may well have noticed it's been invoked a lot in the last month or two. So there's a lot of discussion once again about what does it mean to say, the president recently said he's creating a revolution in common sense. What the hell did he mean?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense it's anti-elitist, right? But that can be, I guess, in favor of progress in some moments in history, and in other moments it's very, I guess, reactionary.
Absolutely true. So for people who are outside of power, invoking common sense is a way to say, okay, we don't have all the credentials you have, we don't have all the authority you have, but we know something, and what we know is enough to change circumstances. So democratic movements often begin from the invocation of common sense. Tom Paine is not alone in that regard. He basically said, politics isn't all that complicated. It's much less complicated than we think. Ordinary people can understand it. And if they use a few basic assumptions like big things shouldn't be ruled by little things, then you have a case for independence for the United States, getting rid of a king, all the things that actually would sound counter to common sense. Now, that's one way of using it. The other way is more demagogic, which is to say, if you're already in power, to say, I'm just speaking from common sense, which says there is no real opposition to what I say, because anybody who thinks something the opposite is really talking nonsense, not common sense. And it marginalizes all other possibilities, saying, they're sort of outside what real people think. And in this case, that often means, as you point out, common sense is pitted against experts and against elites, and particularly against sort of entrenched powers. It's a kind of populist and even demagogic move to say, I speak from common sense if economists and, lawyers and public health experts are telling you something different, they just don't have any common sense. Real people understand me and what I'm doing. And when we finally get to the reign of common sense, we won't need all the rest of this politics altogether. So that's its kind of inverse use.
I mean, it seems like America is the place where common sense still, lives and breathes, right? Perhaps more so than anywhere else, right? I mean, we have this profound belief in the capacity of the ordinary person to participate in democratic government, and they don't need to be experts, right? I mean, I think de Tocqueville had an interesting view of this. He said he loved democracy, but he was suspicious of this faith in common sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's important for there to be some suspicion of common sense. A world without common sense is a place you don't want to live in. But a world that's run entirely by common sense is probably also a world you don't want to live in. And that's why early democracy is imagined quite impressively as a kind of conversation between an electorate that comes to the polls theoretically armed with a kind of common sense and elected officials, including experts and civil servants as well, and a civil society which can work kind of in tandem with that common sense through expert opinion of various kinds. So the perfect combination is elusive, of course, but in some ways you don't want doctors who are never responsive to what ordinary people are telling them about their experience, but you also don't want people operating just based on their experience with no input from doctors who are trained to know something about the world of health and medicine. That Tocqueville was right. He was really always worried about sort of mob rule. He liked democracy in certain ways, but he thought the potential for mob rule would be something like the people's generalized ignorance ruling the day. And so he imagined that there would be a lot of intermediary steps. There's also danger, of course, with rule that's too centralized and too much executive authority, which again would not create this kind of tension, you might say, that's actually productive between people with different points of view and different ways of knowing the world. Democracy is a very hard thing to practice because it's contentious, and it's always contentious. But that's also why, at its best, it's a very good way to rule the world, because that contentiousness keeps lots of different ideas in play, and sometimes in complex ways.
But I think de Tocqueville also was aware of the psychological consequences of perhaps too much choice, right? I mean, he was sort of nostalgic about a world where your position in society was given to you, right? That, based on your family or based on, where you lived or your profession, this was something that you didn't have a whole bunch of choice about. And he sort of thought there was something good about that, right?
So he came from a very aristocratic background, Tocqueville. You can still visit the chateau today in Normandy. That was the family seat. And one of the hallmarks of having been a noble person, even as late as the 19th century when Tocqueville lived, is that many of the things that we'd now say, oh, it's great, she has so much or he has so much choice about, were actually already given to you. So we imagine that maybe if you ascended to a certain social position, one of the great things is you could pick your job, you could pick where you wanted to live, you could pick your spouse, you could pick your furniture, you could pick everything. For an aristocrat, actually the opposite was what gave them freedom. They already had a home, they had a title, they were probably already betrothed to someone, they'd inherited their possessions. In many ways, they didn't imagine picking a location or an employment in the same way. So in many ways, freedom was imagined really strangely differently than it is today. And I think we shouldn't lose track of the fact that while there are freeing aspects, for sure, of our current investment in choice, there is also something about having certain aspects of one's life settled that actually produced a different kind of freedom in an earlier era. And Tocqueville's really, I think if you read his biography, there's a wonderful biography of him by Olivier Zins, an American historian. And it shows him being torn all the time. He realized democracy was modern and progressive, and America was this kind of extraordinary place that he had lots of admiration for, but he was extremely nervous about the unsettling qualities of democracy. And in many ways, he remained an aristocrat tied to those older notions of what it meant to be free. I've never written much about Tocqueville, just in passing, but he's a wonderful figure to think about because he's torn in some ways between the modern democratic commercial world and the old regime.
Yeah, one of the chapters I really liked was the one about choosing a partner or choosing a mate. And you could sort of sense the excitement of that liberation, that people experienced at the ball or the cotillion, but also kind of the anxiety around it, right? There seemed to be a lot of anxiety, not only on the part of the people who participated, but also the outside observers who were concerned that people would make choices based on, whims that would later come back to haunt them, right?
I mean, it does sound scary, right? In a sense, if balls, both popular balls and elite balls, really take off in the 19th century. Everybody goes social dancing, whether they live in Chicago or Santiago or St. Petersburg or Stockholm. It's quite a wide-ranging phenomenon. And they're doing many of the same dances even, especially in sort of emerging middle classes and higher. And waltzing is a big one. And waltzing is quite an intimate dance. I mean, it's two people kind of alone spinning around, touching each other for some period of time in a world in which there's not many other situations in which you'd be alone with somebody that was not your spouse in that kind of close embrace. Now, that all sounds very freeing in a certain sense, but it's also quite a scary proposition to take off with a person around a dance floor, even in a world in which propriety mattered so much. And so one of the things that interests me is that at the same time as choice really takes off in the 19th century and certainly into the 20th, so does a lot of rule-based behavior, or what we might call etiquette. And so a tremendous amount of emphasis went to how to pick correctly who to dance with, protocols, how long could you dance with somebody, would they sign your book with their name before they did or they didn't, could you talk to the person while you were dancing with them, did you need an introduction to make sure it was an appropriate person or did you not? This is discussed over and over again. You could see a little taste of this if you've ever read a Jane Austen novel. They usually have a ballroom scene, and you can see how all of the kind of small details of behavior are closely analyzed for both their possibilities and their pitfalls. But you might think of balls as a modern version of something like Tinder. It's a way to sort of figure out how to connect two people when there's a sea of possibilities.
Yeah, and I did order the Balzac story about the ball. One of many novels that I bought while I was, reading this book. But I think also the concern was that people didn't always know the social status of the person that they might be dancing with. And this was scary for a lot of people, both participants and observers, right?
And that might still be true today in some ways, that most people still to this day marry somebody of somewhat similar background to themselves in terms of class status and educational level and even background, ethnicity. That less today, but still to a considerable degree, even with all the options out there. And one of the things that happens when balls become commercial, in the sense that you could buy a ticket to go in and anybody who could pay the ticket could go in, and some of them were even masked, was that people didn't always know exactly who everyone else was. And this was a terrifying idea. If you couldn't tell from their clothes, if you couldn't tell from their name, how were you to know that you were dancing with somebody of the appropriate station for yourself? For women, it's even more complicated, because a man could dance with a lower class woman, but an upper class woman could certainly not dance with a lower class man. There'd be a lot of honor questions about doing so. And the tensions around that, the 19th century novels are filled with the problems of people who are inappropriate being met at a dance. Either they're already married, or they're of the wrong class, or something makes them an unsuitable partner.
Yeah, I think prostitutes make an appearance in the book, both as sort of, I don't know, pioneers of choice on the one hand, but also sort of, emblems of what goes wrong when you have choice, right?
I mean, to this day, we have enormous arguments, and even within feminism, there are arguments of people who say, sex work is a choice like any other. Why not let anybody make the choice to make a living that way if they want to? Who are you to tell people that they can or cannot sell their bodies? And other feminists who say quite the opposite, that sex work is coercive, that it's not a choice, that it's a realm in which choice should not be even considered feasible. We take other things off the market. Why not take one's body off the market, similarly? And that tension was played out early on too, whether for some novelists and painters in the 19th century, prostitutes are sort of modern women. They've been liberated in some ways to enter the public sphere and do what they want. And others saw them, of course, as fallen women, women who had lost any shred of respect because they'd been, in a sense, reduced to the worst form of employment possible.
It's kind of interesting how the divide between, say, neoclassical economists and behavioral economists, you can kind of see it, as long, going back hundreds of years ago, where some people were celebrating the freedom and others were sort of skeptical or cynical, right? Who viewed choosers as being agents of some outside forces that they were unaware of.
Yeah, and that continues through the 20th century. We're fascinated by choice, I think, in the 20th century, in part because we've invented a lot of sciences for studying how free we are or are not to make those choices. Everybody from psychologists, economists, marketing experts, in some sense, they're all investigating why we choose the things we do, why we choose not to choose sometimes, how to count those choices. And the debate certainly continues. Behavioral economists today will generally take for granted that we have a fair amount of free will, but they remind us that we're not very good at making choices. And in fact, sometimes we are acting contrary to our own interests without even realizing it. Of course, psychologists already knew this, and so did novelists, but economists have been able to sort of demonstrate empirically sometimes the ways in which we don't know our own minds, and we do change them, and we are open to persuasion from advertising, and we're not very good at thinking long term. We do think about women fancy quite a bit. In that sense, the 18th century critics were right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a part of the book where you go into the kind of the origins of marketing as a science.
Yeah, and sort of as soon as there are mass products in stores, people start to think, well, how do we get people to buy those things, right? How do we get them to make up their mind? And advertising starts to develop in the late 19th century in Europe and in the US, and it really takes off after that. And by around the 19 teens, professors of marketing start to appear. It's a brand new field, but the idea is that they can combine a little bit of psychology, a little bit of sort of focus group work, and some sort of business teachings, and they can help figure out both how to persuade consumers what to do, but also how to organize products, how to organize stores, all sorts of ways of displaying the possibilities and encouraging people to pick among them. And choice is therefore a kind of central category early on for marketers who are studying in some ways the science of advertising.
And of course, those insights from marketing make an appearance in politics, right? Politics in a democracy is, to a large extent, all about marketing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what's so interesting. It's a little later to happen in politics, but pretty soon, some of the same tactics are being used. Straw polls, for instance, and later focus group studies and surveys to figure out what the public wants and why the public makes the kinds of decisions it does when it votes in a presidential election, let's say. That happens. And politics itself becomes increasingly organized around kind of platforms of options. Party politics emerges to, in a sense, to market political ideas and candidates to the public. It's not really, though, I don't think, until around the Second World War that there's a real convergence. I mean, I see a lot of parallel strains, but I'm not saying they're all always the same. But in the face of the threat of communism on the one hand and the threat of fascism on the other, one thing that starts to emerge most strongly in the US, but also in other parts of the sort of allied world, is a convergence around political choice and commercial choice, saying that what freedom really is having choice in these two different domains. And from that point forwards, I think you might say that the sort of democracy and capitalism get wedded around the notion that choice is freedom.
Right. And I think every political philosophy has a view of human nature, right? And so this view has a view of the human, right, as this autonomous agent with preferences and some idea of self-interest, right? Is it possible to have a democracy without that view of human nature?
That's a really interesting question to think about. And we may be about to check that out in sort of real terms. I would say that the important piece that you're pointing to of the post-war world is the idea that humans really are fundamentally choosers largely starts to go unquestioned. It's one we're all familiar with now, and it's why I really wrote the book, which is to say, this is, though it feels natural, is actually rather culturally and temporally specific. The idea that we are essentially choosers in a world full of options, and we pick from menus based on our preferences. And that's how people are often studied these days, especially in the social sciences, but it's also how governments often think about people. The question becomes now, I think we're in a moment, a little bit of a crisis of the sort of liberal order. And one question is, can you decouple those things? We're seeing all over the world a kind of libertarianism that's rooted in choice in the economic sphere being attached to increasingly authoritarian forms of political organizing, not just in the US, but elsewhere too, which marks, I think, something of the coming undone of this post-war point of convergence around democracy and choice. China would be the most strong example of somewhere that's incorporated notions of choice in the consumer sphere without moving to democracy. Another question that emerges elsewhere in the world is, can you have democratic forms of government without this kind of choice in the familial sphere, in the commercial sphere, in the employment sphere, different locations will test this pairing in different ways. I think it's not the centerpiece of what I'm studying, but the people who are experts, I hope, in other parts of the world would, I hope will pick up some of this paradigm and ask those questions about specific places. I think the jury's out on the United States right now, as it depends whether the politics of this moment are an aberration or the beginning of something new.
Well, I mean, that seems like a complex and maybe unstable view of human nature, right? I mean, is it possible to have that view that we are choosers in some domains and not in others? I mean, is that consistent with Kant's view of common sense as being more appropriate for some domains than others?
That's a very interesting question to think about. We always have concluded that there are some areas of our lives that we would like to leave outside the sphere of choice. And those are things that we are legally unable to choose. You may not choose whether you pay for it or you don't, for instance, to consume certain drugs. Now there's a black market, but formally speaking, I can donate an organ, but I can't sell one on an open market. And there are ways in which there are always areas that have been sort of made off limits for choice. And, we discuss all the time, they evolve too. Gender and sexuality is currently a kind of open terrain for discussing how much is choice and how much is biology, that sort of question. So it's impossible to imagine a world in which choice rules all arenas. That said, it is hard to imagine a kind of very restricted domain for choice in some areas being easily coupled with a commercial sphere that's constantly telling us it's great to have 3,000 brands of something or 75 ice cream flavors. And it would take, in some sense, a reformulation of our common sense. It would take thinking differently about what humans are, what they do, and what it means to operate in the world. And that's not something that happens overnight. I mean, a revolution is usually needed of some kind, some very profound break, a major war, for instance, to undo ways of thinking that have become ingrained, not just in shallow history, but in this case, over a very long period of time.
Well, I mean, do you think that Roe v. Wade and the pro-choice movement sort of the high watermark of this notion of choice? I mean, it used to be thought that you can't go wrong, right, advocating choice, and I think that we found that you're going to encounter quite a bit of resistance if you use just choice as your justification for a policy, right?
We've now seen policies emerge on the right and on the left framed around choice. School choice is usually more appealing on the right, reproductive choice more appealing on the left. So I would have said that choice is one of those things that we are so used to that it's a kind of unquestioned value across the political spectrum. We might fight about what should be chosen and by whom, but we don't fight about the value of choice itself. And to this day, things are marketed all the time around choice. You look at billboards or look at advertising anywhere you are, you'll see choice is still a really common term for whether it's banking or house cleaning or anything else. That may be ending in some spheres. On the right these days, there is a lot of pushback against certain areas of choice. And on the left, there's a growing skittishness about that framing. In some sense, women today who are fighting for reproductive justice is one of the newer terms being used, are actually picking up threads that more radical feminists, Black feminists, their critiques going back to the 70s, who said choice is kind of weak tea, that just saying you have a choice, but no one's paying for it, no one's giving you time off work, you can't find a clinic near your house, but you've got the choice, is kind of not a very strong stance in favor of one healthcare alternative. And so I think we are seeing some, both right and left, turning away from this notion, even as it keeps cropping up or as part of our kind of default advertising culture.
Now, I think Hannah Arendt makes an appearance in both of these books. I mean, she seems to be among the most astute commentators of contemporary politics. I mean, what could she teach us about how we should be thinking about choice and common sense?
She wrote less about choice than about common sense, but I do find Hannah Arendt endlessly useful for thinking because, in a way, she thought democracy wasn't just about the rules and the laws. She thought democracy required certain habits of mind, and that politics came with habits of mind. And that sounds like a very pretentious way of talking about something. What is a habit of mind? But I think all she meant is that certain kinds of thinking, patterns of thinking, were necessary to sustain democracy. And that it wasn't enough, and here this might echo Tocqueville too a little bit, that it wasn't enough to say, if we've got the right laws and we've got the right, kind of political apparatus, democracy is safe. Well, we might be saying that she was right in various ways. We had to have some, and about common sense, she said, we need some kind of low-level shared commitments for democracy to work. And we need certain habits of questioning authority, for instance, habits of making certain kinds of judgments or choices, for that matter, that were the kind of low-level props to democracy. And I think she's right that, and that's why I'm so interested in these kinds of basic assumptions, in part. Democracy requires ways of thinking and certain low-level ideas that are shared to work. If, for instance, we don't agree that there are rules of the game, if we don't agree there's a certain amount of solidarity between people, even if they don't know each other, if those things, for instance, went away, democracy in the formal legal sense can't be enough. It would just be a matter of courtrooms and legislatures. I hope we can find today some of those kind of low-level shared commitments, because I think it would help us find a solidarity with each other that totalitarian governments, as Arendt said, basically destroys. It pushes you entirely into kind of private life because there isn't really any public sphere. So I find her a very useful touchstone. She's not always easy to read, and I don't think she got every question right exactly, but her basic idea about ideas is sustaining.
But it seems very difficult in today's world to support freedom of choice, but also have a normative view of what the right choice is, right? So if you were to say, hey, I support legal abortion, but I really don't think it's a good thing, right? And, we should try to discourage people from doing it. I mean, that seems a very difficult position to maintain in the contemporary world.
That may be the root of some of our problems thinking about these questions. You may have just put your finger on it. Here's the thing that I think is a little odd about our moment, maybe. Choice once had this kind of very moral apparatus around it. And as I mentioned, over time, choice became more, I would call, value neutral. It meant pick what you like. I don't have to like your choices. It's just what do you prefer? But the strange third twist in this story is that just having the choices itself started to become a moral good. Just saying choice itself was the good. And I think that's not always right, because there are certainly moments in which choice is freeing, but there are also choices that are not freeing. There are choices that are contrary to our well-being. There are places that choice is not a benefit. I mean, this choice of any weapon to buy, for instance, is a different kind of decision than saying, choice in profession. Choice in profession has your choice in profession has little bearing on me. Your choice in weapon might have a large bearing on me or the other guy down the street. So I do question the assumption that more choice, more opportunities, more options is always preferable. It's a sort of libertarian idea, and it has democratic potential. But I hope that we can actually go back sometimes to talking about the moral stakes in the choices we're making. And then we might be able to have better conversations in some ways about why, say, abortion is a good or a bad thing. The argument that it's good because it provides women with equality, or it's good because it's a form of healthcare, is to me a stronger argument in some ways than shouldn't it just be a choice.
Yeah, Sophia, thanks so much. This is great. I enjoyed both of these books. The current book is called The Age of Choice, History of Freedom in Modern Life. But don't forget this one, Common Sense, a Political History. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.